Harold's garage sat at the edge of town like an afterthought. A squat brick building with peeling paint and a tin roof that rattled every time the wind blew in from the hills. The faded letters on the sign above the wide bay door simply read Harold's Auto, though everyone in town knew he was more comfortable with motorcycles than with the endless parade of pickup trucks that came through. Inside, the shop smelled of oil and rust, of old leather and burnt rubber. It was the kind of smell that lingered in a man's skin, so that even when Harold went home, his house seemed steeped in it. He spent most evenings here, sleeves rolled up, wiping his hands on a rag that was permanently blackened, though he still used it out of habit. He was 67 now, shoulders slouched, hair gone thin and gray, and his hands bore scars that spoke of a lifetime spent coaxing stubborn engines back to life. There was a heaviness to the way he moved, a rhythm slowed by years not just of work, but of something quieter, heavier. Since Martha had passed, silence in his house pressed down on him so thickly he had stopped turning on the radio, stopped even opening the curtains. His son Daniel lived 2 states away and hadn't visited in almost 4 years. Harold had quit leaving voicemails too. Many of them had gone unanswered. The garage, for all its clatter and grease, felt more like home than the little clapboard house he slept in. On a gray Tuesday in early spring, the kind where the clouds hung low and the air smelled faintly of rain, Harold heard the cough of an engine outside. A motorcycle rolled into the gravel lot, sputtering, clanking, sounding like it might collapse under its own weight. The rider swung off, pulling off his helmet in a motion that suggested both ease and weariness. He was younger than Harold by at least 30 years, maybe mid-30s, with wind-burned cheeks, dark stubble on his chin, and eyes that carried a kind of restless searching. "Afternoon," the rider said, pushing his helmet under his arm. His voice was steady, but his eyes flicked toward Harold with a kind of careful watchfulness, as if measuring how much space he was allowed to take up. Harold gave a nod. "Sounds rough." His voice was gravelly, worn thin with age and disuse. The rider chuckled. "Yeah, she's been rattling for about 30 miles. Thought she was going to quit on me halfway down the highway." Harold motioned toward the bay. "Push it in." The younger man wheeled the bike forward, the clanking echoing in the stillness. Harold bent down, squinting at the engine, running his hands over the frame with the instinct of someone who didn't need manuals. Just touch. He could almost feel what was wrong before he even grabbed a wrench. The rider leaned against the wall, watching. After a long stretch of silence, he asked, "You ever ride anymore?" The question caught Harold mid-motion. He froze, his hand tightening around the wrench, then set it down slowly. Most customers asked about prices or how long it would take, not about him. He gave a small shrug. Too old for that now. The rider tilted his head, unconvinced, but didn't push. He simply crossed his arms and let the silence stretch, filling the room with the hum of the shop lights and the occasional clink of Harold's tools. Hours passed this way, the slow rhythm of Harold's work interrupted only by the occasional question about the bike. But as the sky outside deepened toward evening, Harold found himself speaking almost against his will. His voice came low, rough, as though dragged up from somewhere he had buried it. "My boy used to ride. Built his first engine right here in this shop." His eyes stayed fixed on the bike as he spoke. "Don't see him anymore?" The words hung in the air, fragile, like something not meant to be heard. He felt a flicker of regret for letting them slip, but the rider didn't pounce on them, didn't pepper him with questions. Instead, the younger man looked down at his helmet, thumb tracing the scratches on its side. "My brother," he said quietly, "died on one of these 2 years ago. I still ride, but some days it feels like I'm chasing a ghost." His words carried no performance, no effort to be profound, just the unvarnished truth of someone who knew silence intimately. Harold didn't look at him, but something inside his chest shifted, the tight knot loosening just enough to let the words settle. For the rest of the repair, they worked in near silence, but it was a different silence than before. Not empty, but full like 2 men standing at opposite sides of a canyon, hearing the echo of each other's grief. When the bike finally roared back to life, its engine steady and strong, the rider grinned. The kind of grin that made his face younger, lighter. "You're a miracle worker," he said. Harold only shrugged. Just a mechanic. But when the man reached for his wallet, Harold shook his head. No charge. The rider blinked. You serious? Yeah, just get her home safe. For a moment, the rider looked as if he wanted to argue. But then he tucked the wallet back into his jacket. Name's Luke, he said, pulling on his helmet. Thank you, Harold. And with that, he rode off into the falling dusk, the bike's steady hum fading down the road. Harold stood at the open bay door, longer than usual, watching until the taillight was swallowed by distance. He didn't know why he had fixed it for free, didn't know why he had told that small truth about his son, but something about the way Luke had listened without trying to solve, without turning away, had left a mark. That night, the house felt a little less suffocating. The silence was still there, but it didn't press quite as heavy on his chest. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at the photo of Martha and Daniel on the counter. For the first time in years, he let himself imagine what it might feel like if someone knocked on the door not to drop off a bill or sell something, but just to sit with him a while, the next week. Harold kept busy with the usual stream of customers' farm trucks needing brakes, a minivan with a failing alternator. But every now and then, he found his eyes drifting toward the gravel lot, half expecting to see Luke roll in again. And one Thursday morning, he did. Luke came not with a broken bike this time, but with 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the road. He set one on Harold's workbench without asking, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Figured you could use one, he said. Harold raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. The coffee was hot, strong, and better than the instant stuff he made at home. They drank in companionable silence, broken only by the faint hiss of the air compressor and the ticking of a cooling engine nearby. After that, Luke stopped by more often, sometimes with a small repair that barely needed doing, sometimes with nothing at all. They didn't always talk about heavy things. Sometimes it was about the weather, sometimes about the new diner waitress who mixed up every order but smiled wide enough that no one cared. Yet beneath the small talk, there was something steadier forming, a rhythm of presence that softened the edges of Harold's solitude. By late spring, the shop no longer felt quite so empty. The clang of tools still echoed, but now it was sometimes followed by Luke's low laugh, with the sound of 2 voices instead of one. Harold didn't call it friendship out loud, but he knew that's what it was becoming. And then, one Saturday morning, everything changed. Saturday dawned cool and bright, the kind of morning that smelled faintly of dew and dust. The sunlight cutting in long slants across the quiet town. Harold had risen early, out of habit more than necessity. He brewed coffee, washed his hands at the sink until the water ran clear from the stains of yesterday's grease, then walked the short distance to the shop. The town was still half asleep, the streets mostly empty, save for the distant sound of a dog barking. Inside, he flipped the lights on, the fluorescent hum filling the silence. He was just setting a wrench on the workbench when he heard it. The low, steady growl of a motorcycle engine approaching from down the road. A single rider, he thought. Probably Luke again. He found himself smiling before he could stop it. But when he stepped outside, rag in hand, it wasn't just one. The sound deepened, multiplied, grew into a rumble that made the tin roof quiver. 1 bike, then 3, then 5, appeared around the bend. Chrome glinted in the morning sun. Leather jackets caught the light. The ground itself seemed to hum with their approach. Harold blinked, thinking at first that it might be some kind of rally passing through town. But no, they were slowing, turning into his gravel lot, engines revving in rhythm, and at the front, helmet off, was Luke. Harold stood there dumbfounded as bikes filled the street and the lot, one after another, until it looked like every motorcycle in the county had descended upon his little garage. Engines idled, riders dismounted, boots crunching against gravel. It was a flood of noise, of presence, until finally the last engine cut and an almost holy silence fell. Broken only by the ticking of cooling metal, Luke walked toward him with that same steady, quiet smile. "Told some folks about you," he said simply. "About what you did for me. Figured you wouldn't brag, so I did it for you." Harold shook his head, speechless. He looked around at the rows of bikes, at the men and women standing beside them, nodding toward him with respect that felt too big, too heavy. He felt suddenly small, his shop suddenly too humble for the weight of this gathering. "I just fixed a bike," he muttered, almost to himself, but Luke heard him. He leaned in slightly, voice low and steady. "You did more than that. You listened. You cared. That's rarer than you think." For a moment, Harold couldn't speak. His throat tightened, his chest aching with the unfamiliar pressure of gratitude pressing in from all directions. He tried to swallow it down, but the sight of so many riders gathered outside his shop, not for a repair but for him, cracked something open inside him. The riders didn't demand anything. They didn't crowd him or shout his name. They just stood there, filling the street with their presence, a quiet show of solidarity. A few nodded. One or two lifted their helmets in a small salute. It was less of a parade and more of a vigilant, unspoken acknowledgement that sometimes the smallest acts ripple outward in ways you can't predict. Harold cleared his throat, rag twisting nervously in his hands. "Coffee's terrible in here," he said gruffly. A ripple of laughter broke the stillness, not mocking but warm, easing the weight of the moment. Someone shouted that the diner down the road was better, and soon enough the riders were filing inside. Leaving just Luke and Harold standing in the doorway, the shop felt different, with the sound of engines fading into the distance. Harold leaned against the doorframe, shoulders sagging, but not with weariness this time, with release. He looked at Luke. "You didn't have to do that," Luke shrugged. "Neither did you. Guess we're even now." They stood there in companionable silence, watching dust settle back onto the gravel lot. Finally, Harold said, "Haven't seen a crowd like that since." His voice trailed off. Since Daniel's high school graduation, he thought. Since before Martha's funeral? Since life had shifted into something smaller, quieter, Luke didn't press him to finish. He just nodded as if he'd heard the rest anyway. The weeks that followed moved with a new rhythm. Riders came by now and then, not in overwhelming numbers, but enough that Harold's shop felt less forgotten. They brought bikes for tune-ups, sometimes coffee, sometimes nothing but conversation. Some were young, eager, restless like Luke. Others were older, their faces weathered by wind and road, eyes carrying stories they didn't always tell. Harold found himself listening more, speaking when he wanted to, not out of obligation, but out of something like trust. One afternoon, a tall woman with gray streaks in her hair leaned against her bike while Harold adjusted her carburetor. "Luke says you used to ride," she said. "Long time ago," Harold admitted. "Why'd you stop?" He hesitated, wiping his hands on the rag, the question heavier than it looked. He could have said age, or the shop, or simply life. But what came out was softer, almost whispered. "Stopped after Martha passed. Didn't feel right anymore." The woman didn't offer advice or pity. She just nodded, eyes steady. Sometimes the road's the only thing that feels right. That night, Harold dug through the back of the garage, past boxes of old parts and shelves cluttered with tools. In the far corner, under a dusty tarp, sat his old Triumph Bonneville. Wheels deflated, chain rusted, paint dulled by years of neglect. He ran a hand along the seat, remembering Daniel's laughter, echoing in the shop the first time they'd tuned it together, remembering Martha's worried scolding whenever he revved it too loud in the driveway. For weeks he worked on it in the quiet hours after closing, coaxing life back into the engine, sanding down rust, polishing chrome until it caught the light again. Luke stopped by often, sometimes helping, sometimes just keeping him company with a steady presence. They didn't talk much about why Harold was fixing it up, didn't need to. The day the Triumph finally roared to life again, Harold felt something bloom in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Not joy exactly, but a lifting, a loosening of the weight he had carried. Luke grinned like a proud younger brother, clapping him on the back. "Told you it wasn't too late," he said, and for once, Harold didn't argue. That summer, Harold rode again. Not far, not fast, just enough to feel the wind pressing against his face, the hum of the engine vibrating through his bones. He rode with Luke sometimes, with others at times, though he often preferred the quiet stretches of road alone, where the horizon stretched wide and the air smelled like grass and rain. He wasn't chasing anything, not trying to reclaim youth or erase grief. He was simply moving again, carrying the memories, but not letting them anchor him completely. People in town started noticing the change. The man who had been the quiet, solitary mechanic now laughed sometimes at the diner, nodded greetings on Main Street. The riders who had once been strangers became familiar faces. The shop, once a place of solitude, grew into something like a gathering spot. A place where stories were traded as often as repairs, and through it all, Luke remained. Not as a customer, not even just as a friend, but as something steadier, a presence that had seen Harold silence, asked one simple question, and stayed long enough to hear the answer. Months later, on another Saturday morning, Harold stood once again in the doorway of his shop. The air was cool, the sun just cresting over the hills. A handful of bikes lined the street, not the overwhelming flood from that first morning, but enough to fill the air with the steady hum of companionship. Luke handed him a cup of coffee, their hands brushing briefly in the exchange. No words were needed. Harold looked out at the riders, at the shop, at the life that had shifted so quietly, but so completely. The grief was still there. Martha was still gone. Daniel still distant, but it was no longer crushing. It was no longer his alone to carry. He raised the coffee to his lips, watching the sunlight catch the chrome of the bikes lined outside. And for the first time in a long time, he felt not just like a mechanic, but like a man who belonged.